There are truths so dangerous that they can only be whispered, and sometimes even whispers are too loud. So instead, people find other ways that do not need words, ways that cannot be heard by others, ways that look like nothing to those who do not know the language. And sometimes, two hands join together in what seems like nothing more than sisterly love. For more than a century and a half, a photograph stayed in an archive, catalogued, kept safe, and sometimes viewed by researchers studying records from the Civil War time. It showed two young black women sitting next to each other in a photographer's studio in Philadelphia. Their posture was formal, their faces calm, their fingers joined in what anyone would think was a simple sign of love between sisters. Nothing unusual, nothing that needed a second look, until someone finally took that second look. In 2013, when a curator made the image bigger using modern digital tools, she noticed something that stopped her cold. The position of their fingers was not random. It was not casual. It was done on purpose, specific, coded, and hidden in plain sight for 150 years. There was a message so carefully hidden that generations of historians went right past it, without ever knowing it was there. If you want to discover what these two women were really saying to each other, and to us, hit that subscribe button, and give this video a like, because what you are about to learn will change the way you see history forever. Dr. Evelyn Harper had been working at the Boston Museum of African American History for nearly 8 years when the anonymous donation arrived. It came in a worn cardboard box, mailed from Philadelphia, with no return address, and only a short, handwritten note inside. "These belong to my grandmother. I think they matter." Inside were 17 daguerreotypes, tintypes, and early paper photographs. Most of them showed black families and individuals from the 1850s through the 1880s. Evelyn had seen hundreds of similar collections over the years. Most were family portraits, records of lives lived during and after slavery, precious but usually ordinary in their setup. She entered each image into the museum's database with careful attention, noting the approximate dates, the clothing styles, the studio backgrounds when visible. She was methodical, professional, patient, and then she reached the 9th photograph in the stack. Two women seated together, sisters clearly. The resemblance was clear in the shape of their faces, the form of their eyes. The older one wore her hair pulled back tightly, her dress high-necked and formal. The younger had softer features, but the same strong look in her gaze. Their hands were clasped together between them, resting on the older sister's lap. Evelyn almost moved on, but something made her stop. She could not explain what it was at first, just a feeling, an instinct that there was something purposeful about the way it was arranged. She picked up her digital scanner and carefully placed the daguerreotype on the glass. The machine hummed softly as it captured the image in high resolution, turning the faded sepia tones into clear digital detail. When the file appeared on her computer screen, Evelyn leaned closer, zooming in on different details: the studio backdrop, the fabric of their dresses, and then the hands. The fingers were not simply holding each other. They were placed in a very specific pattern. The older sister's index and middle fingers crossed carefully over the younger sister's hand, while both thumbs were positioned at exact angles. It looked intentional, controlled, like a gesture that meant something beyond affection. Evelyn sat back in her chair, her pulse quickening a little. She had studied enough about the Underground Railroad, about coded communication systems used by abolitionists and freedom seekers, to know when something needed closer study. This was not just a photograph. This might be a message, and if it was, she needed to find out what it said. Evelyn spent the next 3 days searching through every resource she could find on nonverbal communication systems used during the Civil War era. She looked at quilting patterns that supposedly held directional codes for the Underground Railroad, though many historians debated their truth. She reviewed documented hand signals used by conductors to identify safe houses. She studied the language of flowers, the meaning in hymns, the symbolism in everyday objects, but nothing matched the specific hand position she saw in the photograph. Then she found a reference in an old academic journal from 1987 written by a historian named Dr. Lawrence Winters, who had spent decades researching lesser-known resistance networks in Philadelphia. In a footnote on page 43, he mentioned in passing that some workers of the Underground Railroad had created silent recognition signals, gestures that could be made in public without drawing notice. He noted that these signals were never written down, passed only through direct teaching, and lost to history when the people who used them died. He had found only small pieces of evidence of their existence in letters and diaries, none of which described the gestures in detail. But one letter written by a Quaker abolitionist named Isaac Petton in 1864 contained a sentence that made Evelyn's breath catch. The sisters have perfected a silent tongue spoken with hands alone, which identifies the faithful even in crowded rooms where enemies listen. The sisters, not a general reference to female workers, but specific individuals, known well enough to Petton that he did not need to name them. Evelyn checked the date and location. Petton had been active in Philadelphia throughout the 1860s, working closely with black conductors and free black communities to coordinate escapes from the South. Philadelphia, the same city where this photograph had been taken, according to the faint studio, marking on the back. J. Wilson, photographer, Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, 1863. Evelyn felt the pieces starting to fit together, though she could not yet see the full picture. She needed more. She needed to find out who these women were, what network they belonged to, and whether the hand gesture in the photograph was truly a coded signal, or just a coincidence her imagination had made important. She reached for her phone and called a colleague at Howard University, a historian who specialized in African-American resistance movements. When he answered, Evelyn did not waste time on pleasantries. She simply said, "I think I found something that changes everything we know about the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. Can you come to Boston?" Dr. Marcus Reed arrived in Boston 2 days later, carrying a worn leather satchel and an expression of barely contained curiosity. Evelyn met him in the museum's climate-controlled research room where she had set up her laptop, alongside the original photograph now sealed in an archival sleeve. Marcus leaned over the image for a long moment, his eyes moving between the sisters' faces and their joined hands. Then he straightened and pulled a battered journal from his satchel, handling it with the care reserved for fragile historical artifacts. The journal had belonged to Jeremiah Todd, a free black man who had worked as a conductor in Philadelphia from 1859 until his death in 1867. Marcus had been studying Todd's writings for years, and much of what he had found was routine documentation. Names of safe houses, notes on supplies, records of people successfully guided to freedom. But there were entries that had always puzzled him, passages that seemed deliberately vague or coded in ways he could not understand. Marcus opened the journal to a page marked with a red ribbon and read aloud, "Met with R and N today. They have learned the silent speech, a crossing of hands, a position of fingers. This will be our recognition in dangerous places. Let no word of this be written plainly, for if our enemies discover it, the path will close. R and N." The initials meant nothing on their own, but the date of the entry was June 1863, the same year as the photograph. And the description, a crossing of hands, a position of fingers, matched exactly what Evelyn had observed in the image. Marcus looked at her steadily and said what they were both thinking. These two women in the photograph might be R and N. The sisters Jeremiah Todd had trained in the silent recognition code. If that was true, then this photograph was not just a portrait. It was documentation, proof that the code had existed, evidence of how it looked, and possibly a teaching tool that could have been shared with other workers. But they still did not know who R and N were. No full names appeared in Todd's journal, and the photographer's studio had closed decades ago, its records long since lost or destroyed. Evelyn and Marcus spent hours cross-referencing Todd's entries with other historical documents, church records, abolitionist society membership lists, census data from Philadelphia's free black community in the 1860s, and then Marcus found a letter tucked into the back pages of Todd's S. journal, written in a different hand. It was addressed to my dearest Ruth, and signed simply N. The letter was short, formal in tone, but the content was clear. It spoke of a journey, of danger, of a promise to return, and at the bottom, a single line: "When you think of me, remember our sign. It will keep you safe." Ruth and Naomi. The biblical names matched the initials. And suddenly, the women in the photograph had identities. With names to work from, the research moved faster. Evelyn and Marcus combed through Philadelphia's historical records, searching for any mention of Ruth and Naomi connected to abolitionist activity in the early 1860s. What they found was small but strong. In the membership register of Mother Bethel Church, one of the oldest African-American churches in the United States, two women named Ruth and Naomi were listed in 1862 as participants in benevolent work, a common code word for Underground Railroad activity. No last names were recorded, which was typical for workers who needed to protect their identities. A letter from Lucretia Mott, a prominent Quaker abolitionist, mentioned meeting two remarkable young sisters in Philadelphia in 1863, who had risked everything to guide freedom seekers north. Mott did not name them directly, but her description matched the time period and the level of involvement that Todd's journal attributed to R&N. Then Marcus found a reference in a report filed by a federal marshal in 1863, documenting the capture of a Negro woman, approximately 20 years of age, who had been caught near the Delaware border while guiding a family of freedom seekers. The woman had been returned to Maryland and sold back into slavery. No name was given in the report, but the date was August 1863, just months after the photograph had been taken. Could this have been Naomi? The timeline fit. The location matched routes that Todd's journal indicated the sisters used. And there was one more piece of evidence. A letter written in 1866, discovered in the archives of Mother Bethel Church, signed by someone named Ruth. The letter was addressed to all who remember, and spoke of a sister who had been lost doing the Lord's work, who had given her life so others might be free. Ruth's letter did not name Naomi directly, but the grief and respect in the words made it clear this was a memorial, a way of ensuring that even without records or monuments, the sacrifice would not be forgotten. Evelyn stood in the archive room holding a photocopy of Ruth's letter and felt the full weight of what they had uncovered. The photograph showed two sisters in 1863, their hands clasped in a coded signal that meant safety, trust, and recognition among those fighting for freedom. Within months of that photograph being taken, one of them had been captured, enslaved, and likely killed. The other had lived on, continuing the work, carrying the memory, teaching the signal to others. The photograph was not just a portrait. It was the last image of them together, a message sent across time, waiting for someone to finally understand. Marcus and Evelyn worked with a team of historians, anthropologists, and experts in non-verbal communication to reconstruct what the hand signal in the photograph actually meant. They studied every detail, the precise angle of the fingers, the pressure points where hands touched, the positioning of the thumbs. Then they compared this with small descriptions found in abolitionist letters, church records, and oral histories passed down through descendants of Underground Railroad workers. Slowly, the meaning became clear. The crossed fingers represented intersecting paths, the routes freedom seekers traveled. The older sister's hand over the younger symbolized protection, guidance, the experienced conductor leading the way. The positioning of the thumbs indicated direction, pointing subtly toward the North Star without needing to speak or write a single word. It was a complete message compressed into a gesture that could be made in seconds in public in front of those who would never recognize it for what it was. If two workers met in a crowded market, on a street corner, even in the presence of slave catchers, they could identify each other with this sign and no one else would know. But the code was more than just identification. According to one letter written by a conductor named Elizabeth Harris, the signal could be changed slightly to convey additional information. A different angle of the thumb meant danger. Do not approach. Fingers interlaced in reverse indicated safe house nearby. A brief touch of the wrist meant I have people who need passage. It was an entire language, tactile and silent, designed to operate in the most hostile environments imaginable, and it had worked. Records suggested that the network Ruth and Naomi were part of successfully guided hundreds of people to freedom between 1859 and 1865. The photograph then served a dual purpose. On the surface, it was a formal portrait, the kind that many families ordered during that era to mark important moments or simply to have a record of their existence. But for those who knew the code, the photograph was also a teaching tool, a way to pass the knowledge to new workers, to ensure that even if the original users died or were captured, the signal would survive. Ruth and Naomi had sat in that Philadelphia studio, positioned their hands with absolute precision, and created a document that would outlast them both. They had encoded resistance into a family photograph, hidden defiance in plain sight, and trusted that someday someone would look closely enough to see. In August 1863, Naomi had been guiding a family of 5, a mother, her 3 children, and the mother's proud elderly father, along a route that ran from Maryland through Delaware and into Pennsylvania. It was one of the most dangerous crossings, heavily watched by federal marshals enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act and frequented by professional slave catchers who made their living, tracking down people fleeing bondage. The route required traveling mostly at night, moving through dense forests and along riverbanks, avoiding roads and settlements where they might be seen. According to testimony later provided by one of the children who survived, they had been betrayed by an informant, a man who claimed to be part of the network, but who sold information to slave catchers for cash. The family had been moving through a wooded area just south of the Delaware border when they were surrounded. Naomi had tried to run to draw the pursuers away from the family, but she was captured within minutes. The mother and children were also taken. Only the elderly grandfather managed to escape into the darkness, making his way north on his own and eventually reaching a safe house in Philadelphia, where he told Jeremiah Todd what had happened. Todd recorded the incident in his journal with stark, grieving brevity. Naomi, taken the family lost. We have failed them. But then he added a line that revealed the depth of the tragedy. Ruth knows she will not speak of it, but the light has gone from her eyes. Ruth had lost her sister, her partner in the work, the person with whom she had shared the silent language and the terrible burden of leading others toward freedom, and there was nothing she could do. Naomi had been returned to Maryland, sold to a plantation owner, and disappeared into the Utah records of slavery that rarely documented individual lives except as property transactions. For Ruth, the photograph must have taken on a new meaning after that day. It was no longer just a teaching tool or a record of their partnership. It was the last image of her sister as a free woman, the only proof that Naomi had existed, had mattered, had fought. Ruth kept the photograph for the rest of her life. And when she died in 1889, it passed to her niece, who kept it hidden in a trunk for decades, protecting it from a world that was not ready to hear the story it contained. The photograph survived wars, fires, relocations, and the slow fading of memory. And now, a century and a half later, it was finally being seen for what it truly was. As Marcus and Evelyn continued their research, they began to map the full extent of the network that Ruth and Naomi had been part of. Using Jeremiah Todd's journal, church records, letters from abolitionists, and testimony from descendants of freedom seekers, they identified at least 30 documented cases where the silent hand code had been used to help escapes between 1860 and 1865. The network operated across Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey, with bases in Philadelphia, Wilmington, Camden, and smaller towns along the routes. What made this network particularly effective was its secrecy and its reliance on black conductors who could move more freely through certain spaces than white abolitionists. Ruth and Naomi were part of a generation of free black women who used their positions as domestic workers, seamstresses, and laundresses to gather intelligence, pass messages, and coordinate escapes without raising suspicion. They could enter white households, observe conversations, learn about slave catchers' movements, and relay that information back to the network. The hand code allowed them to communicate in front of their employers, on public streets, even in the presence of authorities, without ever speaking a word that could be used against them. The photograph also revealed something else. When Evelyn examined the studio backdrop more closely, she noticed faint markings on the painted wall behind the sisters, symbols that at first appeared to be decorative touches, but when compared with quilting patterns documented in other Underground Railroad research, matched known directional codes. The photographer J. Wilson may have been part of the network himself, using his studio as a safe space where workers could document their work without fear. This was not unusual. Many businesses owned by free black individuals or sympathetic white allies served dual purposes, operating openly while secretly supporting resistance efforts. By the time Evelyn and Marcus completed their research, they had identified over 50 people connected to this specific network, including conductors, safe house operators, informants, and the freedom seekers themselves. Some names appeared in official records. Others existed only in coded references, initials, and letters, unnamed figures in oral histories. But the photograph of Ruth and Naomi became the anchor point for all of it. The one piece of physical evidence that proved the network existed, that the code was real, and that these women had done exactly what the small records suggested, risked everything to guide others toward freedom. After Naomi's capture in 1863, Ruth continued the work alone. Records show that she remained active in the Underground Railroad until the end of the Civil War, in 1865. And even after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, she continued helping formerly enslaved people navigate the dangers of Reconstruction. She worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, taught literacy classes, and organized mutual aid societies in Philadelphia's black community. She never married. She never spoke publicly about her work on the Underground Railroad. But those who knew her described her as a woman of quiet strength and unshakable resolve. In 1870, Ruth opened a small boarding house for black women, arriving in Philadelphia from the South. Women fleeing violence, searching for work, or reuniting with family members. The house operated for nearly 20 years, providing refuge and support for hundreds of women, during one of the most dangerous periods in American history for black communities. Ruth ran the boarding house until her death in 1889, at the age of 68. Her obituary in a black-owned newspaper described her as a woman of great dignity and faith, but made no mention of the Underground Railroad, the silent code, or the sister she had lost. The photograph remained in Ruth's possession until her death. It passed to her niece, who kept it carefully stored, along with a handful of letters and the hand-stitched quilt Ruth had made in her later years. A quilt that Marcus and Evelyn later realized contained the same directional patterns they had seen in the studio backdrop. Ruth had continued encoding resistance even after the need for secrecy had passed, preserving the knowledge in fabric and thread for future generations. The quilt now resides in the Smithsonian's collection, displayed alongside the photograph, a testament to a woman who never stopped fighting. When Evelyn and Marcus presented their findings at a historical conference in 2014, they showed the photograph on a large screen, pointing out the hand position, the backdrop symbols, the precision of the composition. The audience sat in silence as the story unfolded. The code, the network, the capture, the survival. And when the presentation ended, a woman in the back row stood and asked if she could see the photograph up close. Her name was Clara Bennett. She was 73 years old, and she believed Ruth might have been her great-great-grandmother. Clara Bennett had grown up hearing stories about a woman in her family named Ruth, who had done the Lord's work during the Civil War era. Her grandmother had told her that Ruth had a sister named Naomi, who died young helping others, but no details were ever given. Clara had assumed it was just family stories, the kind of tales passed down through generations that blur the line between fact and legend. But when she saw the photograph and heard the research Evelyn and Marcus had compiled, everything fit together. Clara provided genealogical records showing her family's lineage back to a woman named Ruth, who had lived in Philadelphia and died in 1889. She also brought a small wooden box that had been passed down through her family, containing a few personal items: a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, a pressed flower, and a folded piece of paper with a hand-drawn sketch. When Evelyn examined the sketch, her breath caught. It showed two hands clasped together, fingers positioned in the exact configuration visible in the photograph. Below the drawing in faded ink were the words, "Remember the sign. It kept us safe." This was Ruth's handwriting. Clara's family had been keeping this instruction, this piece of the code, for over a century, without fully understanding what it meant. For Clara, the discovery was overwhelming. She had spent her entire life knowing she came from strong people, but she had not known how strong or what they had sacrificed. She stood in the museum's research room, holding the photograph in her hands, looking at the faces of her ancestors, and wept. Evelyn and Marcus arranged for DNA testing to confirm the connection. Though the genealogical records were already convincing, the results came back positive. Clara was a direct descendant of Ruth, which meant she carried the bloodline of a woman who had helped guide hundreds of people to freedom, who had lost her sister to the cause, and who had lived the rest of her life honoring that sacrifice through service to her community. Clara became involved in the museum's efforts to share Ruth and Naomi's story, speaking at events, participating in educational programs, ensuring that her ancestors' names and actions were finally given the recognition they deserved. And the photograph, that faded daguerreotype taken in a Philadelphia studio in 1863, became one of the most significant artifacts in the museum's collection, not just because of what it showed, but because of what it represented: the ingenuity, courage, and resilience of people who refused to accept oppression, who created systems of resistance that operated invisibly within a society designed to crush them, and who left messages and gestures, fabrics and images for future generations to decode. In 2015, the Boston Museum of African American History opened a permanent exhibit titled Silent Language: Codes of Resistance in the Underground Railroad. At the center of the exhibit was the photograph of Ruth and Naomi, enlarged and beautifully restored, with detailed explanations of the hand code, the network they belonged to, and the fates that awaited them after that photograph was taken. Beside the image was Ruth's quilt, Clara Bennett's family heirlooms, excerpts from Jeremiah Todd's journal, and letters from abolitionists describing the silent speech they had witnessed but never fully understood. Visitors came from across the country. School children stood in front of the photograph, studying the hand position, trying to copy it with their own fingers. Historians debated and discussed the implications for Underground Railroad research. Descendants of other workers contacted the museum, sharing their own family stories, their own fragments of the code that had survived in whispers and gestures passed from parent to child. The photograph had opened a door, revealing a hidden dimension of resistance that had been erased from mainstream history. Clara Bennett, now in her 70s, became a regular presence at the museum, volunteering as a speaker and educator. She would stand beside the photograph of her great-great-great-grandmothers and tell their story, not with sadness, but with pride. She would demonstrate the hand signal, explaining its meaning, showing how something so small could communicate so much in an era when speaking the truth could cost you your life. And she would end every talk the same way. They wanted us to remember. They left this message so we would know what they did, who they were, and what they stood for. And now we do. The photograph continues to be studied, analyzed, shared. It appears in textbooks, documentaries, academic papers. It has become an icon of resistance, a symbol of the intelligence and bravery that allowed the proud Underground Railroad to function even in the most hostile conditions. But more than that, it has become a reminder that history is not always written in words. Sometimes it is encoded in gestures, stitched into quilts, captured in the precise positioning of two sisters' hands as they sat for a photograph in 1863. Ruth and Naomi could not have known that their image would survive, that someone would eventually look closely enough to understand what they were saying, but they left the message anyway. trusting that someday someone would see. And in 2013, someone finally did. The silence was broken. The code was revealed, and two women who had been invisible for 150 years stepped out of history's shadows and into the light, their hands still clasped together, still speaking their silent language, still saying, "We were here, we fought, we mattered. Remember us." And now we do.